Hello and welcome everybody to another podcast episode with myself, Phil Rice, here on YouTube. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today. I'm looking forward to bringing forward another two wonderful returning guests, and we're going to be speaking on the topic of secrecy and esotericism and the relationship between these two points. And if you would like to know how you can learn more about the guests and support them and connect with them and the channel, you can check out the YouTube description below for more details. Thank you so much. All right. So I would like to bring back to the podcast Mr. Bob Smith from 60 Skills. Greetings, Bob. How are you, brother?
I am doing just fine today. Welcome to be back on the podcast and looking to get into it with both you and Mark.
Well, steal the thunder, but he's absolutely right. We're blessed to have the wonderful Mark Stavish here as well with us, and we're going to be getting into some juicy stuff. So I'll bring forward Mr. Stavish. Here he is.
Hello.
Greetings and welcome back, Mark. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, always a pleasure to have you two guys on. I really appreciate your continuing bodies of work, your commentary, and your relentless pursuit for knowledge, truth, and all of those things that are important to keep alive in the minds of people, especially interested in this subject material, and which ties in nicely to the topic we're going to get into today. But before we get into it, are there any things, upcoming events, or courses, or anything that you'd like to bring forward to share with anyone, Bob?
As people know, the work is continuing on the Zodiac course, so hopefully that will be out before the end of the month, along with a potential teaser for the Sephiro course. And we're opening up the aperture on the Kabbalah sessions on Sundays. So if you're interested in any of that, come check it out.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Mr. Mark Stavish, any events or thereabouts coming up in your world?
Well, we have a spectacular set of instructors at the Institute. So we always have courses being suggested by them when we're looking at a few of those now. But the one that I'm trying to get our John White who did our New Thought course, to get him to buckle down and get with me on it, is he promised me a course on Julius Evola and the 3 books Introduction to Magic. So there it is. He said it. He promised it. I know I got to carry half the load, but there it is. We're trying to get that off the ground and airborne. But it's summertime, so you know how that goes.
Yeah, wonderful. And of course, I've got the hermeticinstitute.org website at the bottom of the screen here. Everyone can go and check it out. I've also put the Patreon addresses for both Mark and Bob, so you can support and check out their valued exchange works there. So let's get into it here. So the topic of today was, now we've been chatting in our little group chat about important, relevant things to bring up for the health and well-being of the community. We have maybe some slightly different views on things, but one thing we tend to agree on is that there are common threads that we can draw from throughout history. We can use historical precedents to see, if we do this, then this generally happens. If we don't do this, then this generally happens. And one thing that we've been discussing is this topic of secrecy and esotericism, and the relationship between these two, because obviously in history there's been times when secrecy has been a very functional tool for preserving the teachings, not just in their, say, original forms, but just their survival in general. And some of those practices have been encoding and layering things so that the layman who sees something doesn't see what the deep scholar might see. So Mark, I would love to hear what you have to say on the role of secrecy and esotericism.
Well, secrecy, there's 2 forms. There's the personal secrecy that one should maintain about their practices and the results of those practices. And this is because it's an inner work. It really only pertains to you. and maybe the few people you may be working with, or your teacher, whoever that happens to be. Say if you're doing alchemy and someone's instructing you in it, then your results are only the concern between you and your instructor. It is not something that you talk widely about, which, we see this rule widely broken with social media. People are consistently spouting off about their results. And there's sometimes it is good. There's one good friend of mine who does this every so many months or years. He'll post some very good instructional videos. That's not what I'm talking about. He's doing that in order to inform people of the method and the way of doing things. There's a lot of stuff he's not saying in terms of the inner results. We're talking about people who are just constantly posting whether their dream or their vision or their insight was. This is very detrimental to one's own practice. So there's personal secrecy, and then there's collective secrecy, and that has to do with the secrecy within organizations, generally large structures. And historically, that was done, in Europe at least, in order to keep your head firmly attached to your body, because belonging to some of these organizations was detrimental to your health. Cagliostro was the last prisoner to be sent to the jails of the Inquisition. And of course, we saw in the fascist period in Europe and the communist period, the rounding up of folks, and sometimes in effort to get them to work for the said governments against their will. And this has created a profound sense of personal privacy around it. At other times, it also has to do with the work you're doing. We may know what you do. Your lodge exists. It's not a secret. It's not a true secret society, because otherwise you never get any members. You just die off after the first generation. But the details aren't there, because it really doesn't matter to anyone what the details are unless they're involved in it. And, and we're assuming it's something generally healthy and good for you. So in that regard, secrecy is just a matter of keeping the entity properly charged, because the purpose of group work is pretty simple. You can do more with 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 people or 100 people generally than you can with 1 or 2. So you have that group energy that you're trying to maintain, and you keep that by being quiet about it, by keeping it personal and private to the group. Now, what happens, however, in some of these organizations, and I think this is really what we're aiming at here, sometime at some point, one or more people who are often in charge may start to make requirements on members. And we hear this, I remember hearing this often, oh, that's in the higher degrees. That's in the higher degrees. And it kind of becomes like and no pun intended, a pyramid scheme. It's like a carrot on a stick thing. You'll get that in the future. And that can often be done, as we've seen, to, in some ways, hide the ignorance of those in charge. They may not know really what's going on or have the answers to your questions. And because of the way the situation has developed or built up over the years or decades even, they're afraid to say, I don't know. And I think this is particularly true when we're dealing with organizations that may claim some connection to these vast invisible brotherhoods that we used to hear a lot about. Not so much anymore, but in a lot of literature it was talked about. So, there's healthy secrecy for yourself and who you are and what you're doing. There's healthy secrecy about your group. And then there's that unhealthy secrecy that is really an artificial obstacle, where someone becomes the holder of the keys to the kingdom for whatever personal reasons they think they should be in that role, or whatever benefit they get from it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes. And, you make such a wonderful point there, especially on the topic of, personal secrecy. I experienced early on, that my journal was the best person to tell, as opposed to going, oh my gosh, check out what's going on in my world. And Bob made a beautiful video about this years ago and saying, basically nobody cares, for starters, and you're just basically shooting all of your magic juice off into the void. and not for your own benefit or anyone else's. You're just, venting it out into space. So
I think just one good example of this is, think of a time in your life when you were really excited about something. And you really had this great idea. You were going to write a song or start a band or write a novel, or figure it out, whatever, start a business, whatever it was. And for whatever reason, you decided this was just the best thing in the world to tell somebody who had no connection to it whatsoever. And then it was like all the air went out of the balloon and you couldn't reinflate the balloon. And that's really what a lot of that does. It's you just constantly letting air out of the balloon.
Great. That's a great analogy. Thank you. And Bob, I'm sure you've got something to share on this one.
Sure. I mean, listen, on a practical basis, we're not in a point currently where the authorities are going to come round you up if you say you're involved with, I don't know, mental wandering or astral projection. However, posting a lot of videos on that on YouTube or one of these other sources could definitely hurt you professionally. I mean, most of the better practitioners I know, they might have one or two students over the course of a lifetime. You'd have no idea they're up to this stuff. And they're really good at it, but they keep it private. Even amongst the Chinese with the internal martial arts, you can meet some pretty amazing practitioners in that stuff. Okay, they've got an acupuncture practice, or maybe they have a completely conventional job, and their family just thinks they like to do martial arts a couple hours a day. Okay, that's a practical reason. Another practical reason is, particularly with ritual systems, a lot of these systems work off of what are essentially stored pools of esoteric power. Now, every time somebody does their prayers or whatever, or does a certain ritual, it gets a little more juice. But if you have too many people pulling directly on the battery, sooner or later, the well runs dry. So a lot of these more flash bang traditions I've seen where people can do really flashy stuff, generally speaking, there's only one person in any generation that's really given the keys to that reservoir. I mean, I've talked to a number of people in the Reiki community who said, hey, Reiki doesn't work as well as it used to. Whereas I could see how 60 or 80 or 100 years ago, when relatively few people had access to all the empowerments, there was simply more juice to draw on. So, those are the two most common aspects I've seen regarding what I would call constructive secrecy. Where, hey, this is a serious part of your life, but most people don't really need to know what I'm up to for professional reasons, or this need to conserve access to a power source. I mean, if you take something like the Latin Mass, which is a incredibly powerful esoteric machine, okay, you only get access to that if you're declared a priest in an apostolic line of succession. Otherwise, a joker like me can walk into the Latin Mass. I can see the energy. I can feel the energy. To a degree, I can even touch it. But I can't work it myself. I don't have the key. Now, there are many examples of destructive secrecy. Probably many more of those than there are positive examples. And, this is where you get unnecessary hierarchy, endless uncomfortable challenges you have to work through to get access to things. Like in a lot of the Zen traditions, they have this thing where they sit for like 7 or 8 hours at a time. Well, generally speaking, if you peel the onion back, that came because at some point in time, society was in conflict. People were fleeing to the temples for safety. And so they would make people sit for 7 or 8 hours at a time just to weed out who was sincere. But it never went away. And so now you create this kind of ridiculous barrier to people being able to do anything at all. And this leads directly to Mark's point about how if too few people get the actual training, at the end of the day, you run the risk of nobody being able to do it. Because just because I train somebody doesn't mean they're actually going to be able to do what they were trained to do. So, and again, I've seen secrecy destroy more organizations than not. Where too many people die off, the younger generation's generally not interested. Okay, they anoint a successor who decides he wants to go be in a rock band or run for politics instead, and then the whole thing just dies off. I mean, the gentleman who's in charge of ninjutsu over in Japan, what's his name? Hatsumi. And apparently, when he was younger in his 50s and 60s, he'd have people from other schools just come up and give him the scrolls to their school all the time because they were like, hey, there's nobody left. You're at least serious about this. Now, how much of that stuff did he even learn? Hard to say. But in general, I've seen secrecy be more destructive than not. But like Mark was saying, with modern media today, esoterica becomes an easy way for self-aggrandizement. That's ultimately destructive anyway. So, I don't know. Those are kind of my meta thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. So, many great points here. You're right. There is a role for, I guess, if you're heading an institution or a group or something like that, there's a line of like, it's like the old Fight Club movie, we don't talk about it, basically first rule of Fight Club. Okay. But the thing is that you're like, well, I mean, we still need some people to be in it. And, how do you do that? And so I think what happens is that you have some kind of public interface. I wouldn't call it a facade. It's not insincere, but you're kind of balancing this act between like, well, this can go further, but here is an entry into these practices. And I'm aware that especially for some schools and lodges, they'll have a very common word that they use to attract interest. And then throughout the course, maybe a 12-week course, if people stick around to the end, they might sit down and say, hey, do you want to see where else this can go? Mm-hmm. And a lot of that will have to do with what we want to get into next, which is, the role of literacy and the teachability of people, and also the quality of translators of the knowledge. Because as Mark said earlier, some people only they pitch their tent halfway up the mountain because they've found a couple of tricks, but they don't really know enough. They're constantly luring with things, but they're just kind of dragging you along to a cul-de-sac that goes nowhere, essentially. So as far as like the role of the teacher and the student, so that the student, their sort of responsibility is, like being teachable and being, mindful of being respectful of what the teacher asks. And then there's the role of the translator as well, being genuine. And I have to say, in these previous years, I've discovered Mark Erasmus, and I just find he is a prime example of, I think of what we can look forward to, as far as quality teachers go. So on this topic of literacy, student teachability, Mark, would you like to comment on this?
Well, as I've mentioned several times in the past on different interviews, I mean, the quality of students has really deteriorated in the last 20 years. And it has to do with basic education that, as was said to me, and it really didn't strike me until it was said, Jocelyn Godwin said to me once, I think we were having lunch or something, and it was about just the sheer amount of information or knowledge that you have to have in order to really make sense of esotericism. And it's very, very broad, because esotericism is not a thing that you do. It's an attitude. It's a perception of one's engagement with themselves and the cosmos. And we've treated it as a technique, somehow as a value-free technique. And you don't see that in the classical literature on the subject. So when we're trying to convey that this has a cause and an effect, the effect is in and through the person. So this will change you to some degree. So you have to be willing to accept those changes. And it's just a whole structure in terms of what does the student really want? And you were talking about the outer court, as they often would refer to it, like the Dion Fortune and the Golden Dawn. There's this outer court where you can kind of open up the gate wide, and then you get it's like a funnel, and then you can begin to weed people out. But another one story goes that that the student was asked, why are you here? And the answer had to be something to the effect of, I wish to know in order to serve, or something thereabouts. And that notion of service, how true that question is, but the notion of what service is, it needs to be first and foremost. And then, of course, then the devil's in the details. What does that mean? So your reason for undertaking this has to be something bigger than yourself to some degree. So we're looking at all of these different areas of commotion coming in for modern students. Particularly around technology, because they can just go on YouTube and get all this stuff and think that, well, that's all there is to it. Now, to some degree, this is true. As Jean Dubuis talked about and Dujim Rinpoche, that these things, these teachings are self-secret, meaning that you could talk all you want about it, but if someone doesn't do it, they're never really going to understand it. They're never really going to get it. But in that process, you do get a lot of folks, like you've mentioned, and I said earlier, who they get halfway up the mountain, and then they start talking about, and this has always been the case, this is nothing new. We're just seeing, because of technology, it's easier to do. It's not only easier to deceive yourself, but it's easier to deceive others in terms of what you've got to offer and what it can and will do for them. So I think that's it, learning to help people learn what they need to know as a preliminary before they can go into this. And a preliminary in terms of basic education, like the trivium and the quadrivium. Okay, I mean, if you don't have the capacity to read and write and think logically, it's going to be very difficult to do this work. If you just want to jump into studying sacred geometry and crystals without actually studying geometry first and angles first, then you're really putting the cart before the horse. So in terms of that flashbang that Bob was talking about, there's always been emphasis on the flash. That's how you get the attention. That's not new. We're just seeing that the noise to signal ratio is just dramatically higher for folks in the last 20 years, but really in the last five. I hope that helps.
Very valuable. Thank you. Bob.
This is a bit of a history lesson, and I've talked about this in other places, but prior to the mid 1400s, the Inquisition, all of the basic meditative technology you see in the East existed in the West in one form or another. So this allowed you to have open mystery schools all over the place. A lot of people using internal power systems, and nobody cared, just as it is in Asia today. With the Inquisition, a bunch of things happened that weren't really directed at esoterica, but were directed at organizations that were competing for power with the proto-states of the time and the church. And these esoteric organizations got caught up in this. It's relatively easy to train somebody to spot an internal power practitioner because they're eternally carrying a charge around with them. And so just a little bit of clairsentient or clairvoyant training by itself is enough to spot these people. So essentially what happened is the Inquisition started. The Cathars were a big part of this, but there were other reasons for that too. So the church went around to all of these mystery schools and said, all right, no more openly teaching people. Can't do that anymore. Okay. That didn't take very long. Then they went out and started tracking down all these individual practitioners, and they said, all right, here's the deal. You're allowed to do what you do, but you're not allowed to teach anybody else. You're not allowed to be public about it. And keeping in mind, the church only officially executed something like 2,500 people over a 400-year period. You know, they were going out of their way to avoid killing people, to be completely honest with you. Now, that's not to say some wacky village tribunal somewhere wasn't, stringing people up to steal their property or whatnot. But the change that this created was now, if I wanted to learn how to do some of these things, I had to find somebody to learn from, and I couldn't stay there very long. Okay. So I make up an excuse. I'm dropping off bread, a load of firewood, merchant train, whatever. All right. Stop off at my teacher's house. Spend a couple days there because, hey, getting around at the time was the speed of walking or the speed of a horse. So things happened pretty slow. Weather was a problem too. You'd practice for a couple of days. And keep in mind, I've had really good results from doing short 3 and 4 day one-on-one seminars where I teach a bunch of material to a student one-on-one, tell them to leave and come back, 3 or 4 months later. So this is a model that works. Well, here's the thing, and this gets back to the whole literacy part. You would need to write down the instructions of what you were doing. That way the student had something to reference when he wasn't with you. In Asia, for the most part, this never happened because you could always wander off to the Himalayas, wander off to a temple someplace, find a teacher, and stay there for as long as you wanted. All right, so you practice for a few days with your teacher. He writes some notes down, maybe more complete, maybe less so. Probably writes them down in a way so that they don't make any sense to somebody who hasn't been initiated. That way the authorities, specifically the church, who was literate, didn't have a paper trail to come after you with. Your student took off for another 3 or 4 months, went about his business, and then came back 3 or 4 months later. So in the West, there was a societal reason why we wrote these things down. This is where the whole grimoire thing came from and all this other kind of business that never really happened in Asia for the most part. So that's an important part about literacy. Now, here's the other end of this. Here's the impolite end of this that nobody in this business wants to discuss because it's bad for business. Your successful student generally has a very healthy body and generally has an IQ somewhere north of about 125 to 130. If someone has an IQ of 115, they can do the work, but it'll be slow. So in a modern Western society today, that is no more than 14 to 15% of the population. That's it. Full stop. Now, if someone's not that bright, they can learn individual techniques, maybe some energy work, a bunch of other things, all of which is truly useful. And again, this has nothing to do with education. This is just pure mental processing power. Because particularly in the internal power systems, you have to be able to hold 3 characteristics at once: color, sound, sensation, or you can't do it. Generally speaking, somebody has to be fairly intelligent to do that. And it's not something you can train someone to do if they don't have the internal brain power to do it with. Well, in a modern developed society, if you're that bright, you're generally literate. You generally have the ability to engage in delayed gratification. You generally have the ability to separate your emotion and your thought process to at least some degree. And so that in particular, the literate aspect of this drove the need the need for the Western associations to function differently. Now, unfortunately, the secrecy aspect got so out of hand. The Enlightenment path in pop culture involving Hermetics is basically ignored. All they talk about is sorcery and thaumaturgy and working magic. The Enlightenment path is there and historically was the more important of the two. But secrecy overwhelmed what went on with this to such a high degree because of the Inquisition and other factors that happened later on, that even the knowledge of that got lost. So when you talk Enlightenment these days, most people without proper training in this stuff assume that's purely an Asian thing and has nothing to do with the West. So, like I said, it's an interesting set of historical events that led to this. But that's also the reason why these things in Asia are dying. People don't realize the destruction of the communist versus these 1,000-plus-year-old orders is almost complete. The demographic collapse in Japan is destroying Shingon as we describe it right now. So, the West in some ways caught a lucky break by writing things down, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and obviously we've seen a rise in self-censorship as well, where people are a little more reticent about sharing things, and I can imagine that shares some sort of parallels with maybe what happened during the Inquisition, where there was fear about talking about things. And now also, related, unrelated, but as a teacher, when I get asked a question, I want to convey the highest quality understanding I can so that the person takes away something essentially greater even than what they had before, an understanding that they can apply, or just have them satisfied that they've received a good answer, an appropriate answer. Now, obviously, some questions, when they're asked, require a lot more context than maybe you have the energy to deliver in the 5-minute pocket of time that you're standing at the cocktail party and someone asks you something and you're a specialist and you go, to really answer that, we might need to take a seat. And then, of course, is that person capable of taking that on? And choosing, I guess, how deep you go with the conversation as well, because sometimes I'm a TMI guy. I'll just give everything that I've got and it just goes over the head, and I've spent myself in this conversation for no real benefit for anyone, and that's trained me well over the years, teaching young students who don't have the internal capacities to action out the musical skills that I'm trying to impart upon them. And so when Mark brought up the trivium, that brings up another thing that we briefly mentioned just prior. The trivium for the audience, in a nutshell, is the process of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, or we could call it grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then in a modern sense, we could call it input, processing, and output. This process of first gathering information, which is the knowledge. We gather the knowledge. The knowledge is not wisdom in and of itself. It's just, say, raw data, and we go and we collect that and we gather that. We do our due diligence robustly, rigorously. We want to flesh something out and really get to know something. Unfortunately, people are very sensitive in modern times. And so when they come across information that makes them feel uncomfortable, it's important, it's nutritional, it's valuable, and it needs to really be explored to have a true width of sort of, a good read into what this is going on. But because they've got this heightened sensitivity, they're triggered by certain words or themes, it prevents them from exposing themselves to it. And a classic example is, I got challenged many years ago by a very materialistic chap on the topic of Reiki. He's a very well-known psychologist fellow, and he sent me a whole bunch of links to skeptic websites about Reiki. And I have to say, I was pretty anxious, and I'm like going, perfect, I need to dive into this and challenge myself. And I did, and I'm better for it. Why? Because I soon discovered what most people were talking about from a skeptic's point of view is that they actually had some valuable considerations for me to consider as far as presenting conversation that people could understand. But on the flip side, they were also just scoffing and mocking with no real personal experience as well. So, I found value on both sides. But the thing is that there was an initial hesitation and a reticence for even exposing myself to this information. And I thought about this, that when I have students come to me who want to know about Reiki, they may come from a Christian background. They may come from a materialist background. They may come from this and that. And it's like, okay, they're asking me a genuine question. They may have some internal biases that stop them from being able to take it on, because as soon as I mention a certain word, God, energy, anything like this, oh, no, that's a bad word. I don't want to listen anymore. I'm thinking about a response rather than listening. And so they basically cut themselves off. And so then I go, okay, on the topic of secrecy, so sort of, it's more like I don't need to give them that much. I need to just be conscious that I only really need to give them what I think they need. And so that is a type of a secrecy, I guess. But, as far as like the nature of sensitivity in the modern age and how that sort of prevents us being able to share information, because, even Mark mentioned it before, we're trying to find the sweet spot as teachers. So I've wandered off here, but this topic of sensitivity, Mark, if you'd like to jump in on this, as as a hindrance, I suggest to the continuity of the teachings.
Well, I mean, we saw it really from about 2016 on. We saw the sensitivity result in the politicizing of a wide swath of modern contemporary movements and virtually destroy some of these organizations. Some of them were. And there was a lot attempt to edit and to keep things unpopular opinions or ideas or even facts from being discussed. A lot of things degenerated into name calling. There was an attempt to get the forward from my book on egregores pulled. Now, if that isn't an example of an egregore in action trying to censor a book on it, because people were offended by the content. Of course, we've seen that content vindicated several times over in the last 2 or 3 years by the admission of the media itself. But that's the kind of thing that you're looking at in terms of what you're dealing with. People who just can't handle the truth. They're just afraid of it. What they want is a trick to solve their life because they don't want to deal with their life. They want a Band-Aid. Well, that's too bad, which means this isn't for everyone, which means the notion of the democratizing of occultism is essentially a modern notion or phenomena, which is really just an extension of Marxist rhetoric into the spiritual domain. This stuff has always been elite. It's always been elitist because you're joining what is essentially a hierarchy of capacity. You have to know who's better than you and what they're better than you at so that you can learn from them, which means you have to be honest about your limitations so that you can overcome them. Now, this is really well done because I remember the first time I heard it, I laughed. And it was when Alama was talking about, what do you give for stupid students? I thought stupid was funny because we don't like to talk about people in those terms. But these other people are stupid and you have to teach them. And what do you have for them? And then it became very clear, I get it. Okay, that's why, we have these, you have these outer tantras, these inner tantras, these secret tantras. And then, of course, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, and this is based on the capacity of the student. So they've got an organic and integrated ladder there of capacity. So the teacher discusses with the person, gets their capacity down, and then makes a teaching based on it. And we don't really have that because what you're looking at is, again, you're not told that people have different capacities. There's the unwritten, unspeakable rule that we are all equal and interchangeable in our capacities, and that if you just give people the information, they'll be able to handle it. No, they won't. No, if they were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If they were, we wouldn't have had the last 3 conversations we've had. Now, this is really critical because now you as a teacher and anyone who's teaching needs to recognize that they need to have the capacity when discussing with someone what their capacity is of that individual and then have 3 levels of teaching for any one subject. And we'll call that a very basic subject, a very basic and fundamental approach, which is basically, if you were a beginner, what is the first 1 or 2 things I would teach you? And again, if you can't explain this to your grandmother, you don't know it. So those of you who are too much information guys, you don't really understand the material if you can't tell your grandmother. And that's because, again, we have grown used to so much information into our heads. And we have to get out of that bias. It's very important that we have that information, but now you have to be able to convey it to another. So then your second level of teaching is someone who's, they're pretty good. They're better than the average. They're going to be like the guy who plays on the maybe the college level baseball team. Maybe even semi-pro baseball, which around here, these guys make pretty decent money. Okay, unlike semi-pro football where they're all broke. So they make pretty decent money. So maybe this guy, what are you going to teach him? How are you going to train him? Now he's not going to go pro. Most of them are. And then there's what we'll call your professional level. So, and Bob could probably give some examples of this. I mean, what do you teach the guys in the National Guard versus the guys who are full-time versus the guys who are special operators? The special operators went through all that basic stuff. They went through all the stuff the National Guard were going through. They went through all this stuff the regular guys went through. And then they got extra good at it. A lot of the times it wasn't learning anything new. It was getting extra good at what you already had learned. And it's the same way in almost everything that we do. So teachers need to have that capacity. Now, again, in a system like the Golden Dawn, and I like to pick on it only because it's so widespread and people often have unspoken problems with it. And it's got a great stuff, by the way. It's a lot of great stuff to offer. But it doesn't have those like 3 levels of teaching. You're going in and it's trying to guide you so that you can become very skillful in these other ritual levels, which are very complex. So it's a big funnel and a narrow straw that you go up with the idea of getting to that end. So a lot of people run into magical systems and they're trying to compare apples to oranges, or they're saying, well, why is this it's just watered down? It's not the same. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles. When in the hands of a skillful operator, that very simple system may be extremely operatively functional and very successful, because again, it always works in and through the person. So we have to find what the person is skilled at. And going back to the capacities, some people are better with emotional aspects. We want to give them a devotional system. Some people are better with mental aspects. We want to give them a thought system, heavy on the visualization. Okay. Other people are going to be more with kind of a verbal system or auditory. So we want to work with them on sound and emotions as well. Okay. And then there's action. Where do we bring the physical actions into this and help integrate and bring them together? So that's where that problem arises in many of the Western systems. They really are a one size fits some, but it's trying to be a one size fits all.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and just quickly, in my time as running a guitar teaching or a music teaching school, I had basically 60, 70, 80% of the base of my income was just, young kids coming in, and then they would filter up, and then I would put them into pairs. I would teach 4s, 2s, and 1s. The kids that I preferred teaching them in pairs, to be honest, because there was a social strengthening, but some would come to me for single lessons, but I only reserved those for hardworking students. You basically had to earn that time with me, because people wanted, I was in hot demand, which was wonderful. I felt very blessed in that, very encouraged. But it's like, it's not very professionally satisfying when your output is, it's got mediocrity as a prime ingredient. And for me, what attracted my business towards me was my output. And obviously, there's this conversation, and it comes to for example, Tai Chi. There's all these Tai Chi masters that can do all this really amazing stuff, but they can't teach it. How do we know this? Because their best students can't do it, but they can somehow do it, but they don't know how they did it. And some might be honest about it and some might not be. But if you've got the special sauce, but you don't know how to pass it on, but you're reliant on what that brings, I mean, that I would struggle sleeping at night if I was operating like that personally. But Bob, Mark was talking about, your time and teaching and things like this. So I'd love to hear what you've got to share on this.
Internal power practice filters people out very quickly. I mean, to be blunt, aside from those physical and mental requirements to pursue that path, you have to have the ability to suffer and overcome. So for these internal power systems, whenever I get the backstory of my students, every time I think I've just found like the worst thing that could ever happen to a human being, I get a new student, and then it even gets even worse. These are all people that overcame significant adversity in life, and that allows them to fight through the discomfort of internal practice. Listen, internal practice is going to change you. It's going to be painful. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to do things to you that you don't like, but you only get to the good stuff by fighting your way through it. Now, this creates another problem in that if you're stupid enough to try to make a living at this stuff, okay, you have to accept that a lot of your students are dabblers. They're not going to go the distance because those are the students that pay the bills. Listen, Tai Chi Master is a good example of this. You got 50 people at the weekend seminar. 40 of them aren't going to practice outside the seminar. Another 8 are going to practice a couple hours a week. And maybe one guy in 50 actually intends to really do something with this. If you're teaching publicly, you have to accept that. Now, this leads into this whole issue of outer, inner, and kind of secret teachings where you filter people through. And again, Mark did a good job of describing the 3 or 4 tiers of people that you basically wind up with. But that's not bad. I mean, listen, if you go to Thailand, right, and you decide you want to become a Theravada monk, okay, the odds of you're winding up a cook or a plumber or a CPA or an academic are far higher than being the guy who's going to be the serious meditator who ends up becoming the abbot of a temple at some point. Why? Because big organizations need people to do all those things. And this is something that, I don't know, might be off track, but I want to make clear, first of all. When you're talking these older, more traditional systems, they are profoundly religious. I mean, if you're learning Tibetan yoga, you're learning Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, really. Now, there's ways of stripping that stuff out and just doing the mechanics, and that stuff actually works quite well. But as it's presented, it's profoundly religious. I mean, about a year and a half ago in my private practice group, we worked most of the way through the Ars Notoria, which was recently translated by Stephen Skinner. Wonderful translation. This is a deeply Christian-influenced work. And I'm not talking like 1960s Christianity either. I'm talking like 1400s Christianity, okay? Lots of prayers, lots of devotional prayers. You have to do all of that to make the system work. And this is a big problem with modern people, is that they don't want to go through the trouble of being an internal power practitioner because it sucks and it changes you. Okay? It sucks. Just period. I could get into lots of stories about how I lost months at a time of my life to things that cooked off wrong or didn't work out the way they were supposed to. But they also don't want to subject themselves to the religious aspect of a ritual system. So now you're caught in between, right? Too hard for the soft, too soft for the hard is the classical terminology goes with all of this stuff. But you don't get to practice the Ars Notorio and get through the trivium and all these other things and the ability to learn language in a matter of weeks without doing all of this fundamentally deeply reverent Christian prayer. It's built into the system. Now, an internal power practitioner with enough work might be able to decode, what you need to keep and what you don't. But I'm here to tell you, if you go through the Ars Notorio, you're going to be praying to the big man upstairs and Jesus Christ for about 2.5 hours a day for 6 months straight. And if you think you're going to do that and it's not going to affect you, all right, I'll take the Pepsi challenge on that one every single day. And this goes back to your comment earlier about a lot of skeptics out there. The easiest way to defeat a skeptic when it comes to esoteric is like, all right, fine. Here's the practice. Give it 3 hours a day for 6 months. Then let's talk. You know how many people have taken me up on that challenge over a 30-year period? Not a single one. Because you can talk all the smack you want about theory. Bring it on. But I say this all the time. People in the past weren't stupid. They weren't going to devote significant time and resources to something if they weren't getting something out of that. Now, were classical herbal preparations as good as a shot of penicillin? Probably not. Definitely not. But they did work. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it at all. Wouldn't have survived. So that's my comeback for all the skeptics out there. Hey, if you can take the Pepsi challenge and come out of this completely unchanged at the end of 6 months, good on you. Haven't seen it happen yet. So there you go.
I have just a little story on that all of the married men will laugh at out there. Several years ago, I got re-invited to come speak at our local Unitarian Universalist church. And my wife said to me, now be nice when you're up there. I said, I am going to be nice. They invited me. I got a cast. So the first words out of my mouth, I said, well, I have a captive audience here. So you're probably going to go for about 30 minutes on the talk. You can listen to the recording too, because it is at our Teachable site. I think it might even be somewhere online. And at some point, I do believe in that talk. I said, well, the funny thing is, no one ever says they don't believe in demons and all of these things. I said, but there's an easy way to check. I said, here's some chalk, and I hold up the chalk. I said, I'm going to tell you the rituals to perform to invoke the 4 arch kings of hell. And here, you can do this, and then let me know if you still don't believe. Now, the point is, they can probably do the ritual, nothing's going to happen. But what it does is it forces them to realize that they're full of crap. that there's a lot of things inside that they've intellectually told themselves don't exist, but, well, they really haven't resolved that question. I don't think my wife thought I was nice that day. I thought I was doing them a favor. So, yeah.
Yeah, so there's testable things out there, and people are happy to get on the ante, but it's like, well, just check it out for yourself. No thanks. So wait a minute, what are we trying to propagate in society here? A testable means of like the truth doesn't care whether you believe in it or not.
Well, this is one of the things you find with folks who are negative towards psychic and paranormal phenomena. We have 120, 30, 40, I think about 150 years of published literature now from various psychical research societies. Now, go read it. But that would take work.
Well, I mean, it's like a lot of those old Russian, Soviet, and Chinese studies. Yeah, the sample groups were small, and people will whine about that. And there's a lot of stuff going on that we couldn't measure particularly well. But if you read these studies, you can tell something was going on. Now, frequently what that was isn't particularly clear, but you have to be pretty disingenuous to say it was completely something of your imagination. And that's the reason why, like in the work that I do at Letter Magic, we stress body training so much. If you've got decent body training down and you start to generate energy at the subtle level, okay, fire, air, water, earth, it's my imagination. I'm manipulating my sensory apparatus. Fair enough. Until you generate Akasha or void power on your own, and then everything just completely falls apart. Now, half those guys end up running away after that because, oh shit, I got the Lord of the Rings moment, and that was a bit more intimidating than I wanted it to be. But again, even the amazing Randy, I knew people when he was alive who wanted to demonstrate cloud bursting and a bunch of other phenomena, which you can train somebody to do in about a week. He wouldn't meet with those people. So Randy wasn't really interested in objectivity. He was just a hack. And if you knew his backstory, his hackery was well understood by most other people. And that's the problem you get in with that materialist mindset is any threat to that at all, man, and the walls just come up. And it disenfranchises people from this stuff. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think this goes back to what you said earlier about, there's a lot of people doing this who, we're all doing it unconsciously. That's the first thing. What we do with practices is we learn how to do it consciously. And there's a lot of folks who are doing this quite well consciously, and they're making their lives better for it and the lives of those around them, for the most part. And you can meet them on occasion. They may even talk to you about it, but you have to show a certain degree of discrimination and discernment and not just be a chatty Cathy about everything. And going back to what Bob said, what you said, Phil, about students. Jesus in the Bible, there's a saying where he goes, to them I give milk, but to you I give strong meat. And the idea is that even there within the church, there was a notion of inner and outer teachings as early as, the lifetime of Jesus. And we see that because not everyone, no one has the right. There's no right to have access to any of us. They just don't have that right. What they do have is the convenience of the capacity to reach out and annoy you through direct messaging or an email. But they don't have the right to do that, just the ability. And, when you're concerned about doing something, whether it's building your program, building your business, building an institute, building whatever, you focus your time on those people which are most beneficial to helping you achieve those goals. Well, there's nothing selfish about that. That's all voluntary on their part. They've decided that this is important to them too. I want to learn how to play the guitar and I want to get good at it. Well, you're willing to spend your time with them. I want to learn how to do body center practices. Okay, you get it. And I think that goes back to this notion of democratizing of the whole practices. It's really a lie in that regard, because what it's not really democracy. It's just self-serving consumerism on some level, consumption, because we're going to use our time wisely, and that means we're going to be most helpful and useful to those people who are most helpful and useful to us, which often means the best students are most capable of carrying this on for another generation or two, because it's about progression of the knowledge and the wisdom, not just you learning some trick to fulfill whatever your particular transient desire is. And I can't stress that enough, because that's why that's where secrecy comes in at times too, because you just want to keep people away. And there's a lot of different ways it's done. I just want to say Joe Oshesky was funny about it. He used to respond to emails with a fictitious character. He created his own administrative assistant who would answer his emails to get rid of people, so that they would project their frustration and anger on her rather than go online and badmouth him even more than they already were. So there you are.
Yeah, so this is it, like I'm noticing this when I had my guitar teaching business, or even this YouTube channel, as the interest grows in it, there's sort of proportional kinds of new things that arise because the things are scaling up. I'm getting much more incoming contact. I mean, I'm looking through the chat for questions to bring up, which we'll certainly get to in a moment. But, how relevant are those things? I'm having to do some active filtering and these types of things. And I'm like going, man, if I was going to have a party at my house, I wouldn't just open it up to everybody, because I want to provide a wonderful experience for all the people that I'm inviting. It's a thing I care about the people I'm bringing in. I want to host a nice thing. If I start bringing in random variables, who knows which way is it going to go? And I feel that's a disingenuous way of operating, and especially as a teacher. And so I personally, in the Reiki system, there's 3 levels. And the first level, it's like, here, touch vital force, get involved with it. Here's some precepts, rinse and repeat through some other processes and do this. This will change you. And then I will know if these people, because I will sit and get to know them first, and I will see how they've changed and if they're ready to go to the next level. And I just think that this is actually, it's you could call it a kind of a secrecy in some ways, but it's more like a rush to show everyone all your cards or all what's on the table and things like that. There's a novelty aspect that maybe wants to be brought out or expressed, but over the years I've pulled back on that, because even as a guitar player, because guitar players, everyone's a guitar player, right? That makes up the majority of the musical instrument players on the planet, and they all love showing off. And they can play an intro to a song, but they can't play the whole song. And so they can take you so far. And a teacher can only take you as far as they themselves have been. And, I guess this is a work in progress. And another trend I've seen is that a lot of teachers I'm hearing about are shrinking their class sizes, especially with one-to-one teaching, because they can be much more effective with smaller groups. Not necessarily to put better students out there for advertising to bring more in, just because it's far more satisfying and energizes them and gives them a real sense of achievement in what they're doing. Because, I mean, if you're mowing the lawn every day and it doesn't look any different, you can start losing heart with this. But I just wanted to say, gentlemen, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, but there was one thing that Mark brought up that I think we do well to approach, especially from an esoteric point of view, is the astrological influence on and to secrecy, Mark, that you brought up prior to the live. So if you would, please, sir.
I think that the notion here is of the Saturnian influence of silence, that things have a life cycle to them. And if we don't understand that life cycle, we can get up putting a lot of energy into an activity that either is not going to bear fruit at all, or at least not going to bear fruit in the time frame we think it is. And you see these different organizations that often come and go, and you look at their life cycle, and it's quite fascinating. I noticed right before COVID, a lot of organizations that were in the 27, 8, 9, 30, 31 year period, 32 period, all within that Saturn return or approaching Saturn return, just went belly up, closed their doors, done, over, gone. Publishing houses too. So when we look at the life cycle of something, we have to bring that into it. How long is it going to take to train someone? How old are they? What are their obligations going to be in that period? But also then you're looking at the organization or the movement or the teaching structure as a living being itself. And astrology can play a tremendous role in that.
Thank you. Yes. And Bob, have you got anything to add on this?
A good reason for secrecy involving astrological influence is contacting the spirits of the planets is relatively easy to do. If you don't have good esoteric hygiene, if you don't have a mechanism for making them go away, these things can heckle you 24/7. They can be quite manipulative, to be completely frank. So you have to be careful with that. Now, the entities of the zodiac, they're much more mental, therefore it's a lot harder to get them to manifest a negative aspect of what they're doing. But here's the thing. And this is where internal power practitioners get it wrong with the ritual guys a lot. Okay. Ritual guys, because they're generally not internal power guys, they got to work in groups. There's a long wind up and pitch, if you will, when they're going to make something happen. But they build up very potent charges over a long period of time. And they like to time it with the right astrological influence to make it easier to do. So they can actually pull off some pretty amazing things. They just can't do it quickly. Even as an internal power guy, I learned to work with the powers of the planets. Now, that's pretty shitty. I mean, when I was working through Mercury, I gave myself an epileptic seizure. When I worked through the sun sphere and wasn't smart about it, I gave myself a psychotic break that lasted about an hour and a half and destroyed a bunch of furniture in my house because I wasn't careful with my esoteric hygiene and accidentally invoked a negative aspect of a sun sphere entity. When I worked with Saturn, I gave myself a severe case of tachycardia the first time I did it because I wasn't particularly careful with my clearing efforts afterwards. But if you can get past that and you work with these things long enough, a lot of people call it an immunity to the effect of a planet. I would say it's more akin to a keen awareness of how it influences you, so you can mitigate that in a way that most people are passive participants with. Just as there are the skeptic studies who say, oh, there's no difference in hospital ER rooms on the night of a full moon. Anyone who's ever been an ER nurse or an ER doc will tell you, the day before the full moon, the day after the full moon, watch out. This is when the weird stuff happens. Why? There's more astral energy available for weird stuff to happen with. Because the moon is the most astral energy charged of the planets. I could go on, but they're important. And the ritual guys, hey man, when they're smart, they can do some pretty amazing things by doing work over time in groups and taking into account astrological influence.
Wonderful, thank you. I just think across the board, it's pretty hard to deny, especially if we just look at the two most obvious bodies being the sun and the moon, how much they affect, their cycles affect what happens here, even behavior wise, without even having to get into esoteric conversation. But you're absolutely right. As far as secrecy goes, we're going to have our proclivities and tendencies influenced by, how we share information, whether or not we choose to share it, and the medium, perhaps even, depending on what's dominating at the time. Now, I've got a question here from Spectra in the chat. I'm going to just slightly translate it a bit. How do you assess the student's most effective learning modality? So I'll say my understanding is that someone comes to you, they recognize that you're a teacher of some esoteric tradition or internal tradition, and you may have a handful of things. I mean, for myself, I teach Reiki, I did Qigong, a bit of Tai Chi and a bit of Hermetics and these types of things, or just meditation in general and relaxation and things. And depending on what the person's need is that I can ascertain from having a one-to-one sort of conversation, if they want a thing done to them or for them versus they want to learn something, I'll generally try and encourage them to take on at least a meditation practice. But I generally will just sit down and get to know them first. And generally a natural obviousness of how to help them will arise, because I'm there to serve, and I kind of just get a knowing, and that's probably come a lot from a lot of the training that I've done as well. But Mark, have you got something you'd like to share on this person's question?
Well, I mean, you nailed it. You just have to get to know them, and it can be a short conversation. It might only be 15 minutes. It could be an hour. Usually somewhere in between, you'll get a sense of them and their background, what they like to do, what their profession is, what they like to study, what brings them to you. All these things get answered often very quickly. And you can use some NLP if you like. I mean, that's a fair mechanism to assess what are the language that they use. Language is a very important tool, particularly in magic. So you listen to the words they use and how they speak about things. This tells you a tremendous amount about their psychology and their self-image and how they process information, just listening to the words that they choose and use. So, and then you can even just ask them. And from that, you find out what is useful to them. Again, there has to be mental training involved. So there's going to have to be some kind of meditation, but what is that going to be? I mean, everybody can breathe. Everybody can sit and breathe. So everybody can train their mind with breath. And that's where we start everybody anyhow. There's no shame in it if that's all you ever do, because it can take you very, very, very far if you do it. On the other hand, as Bob mentioned, we could start you out with some wonderful magic from the 16th, 17th, 18th century. But you'd better be prepared to do 3 to 6 hour rituals, often for several days straight. And then you look and said, oh, now I see why all the members of those lodges were, nobility or garrisoned military officers or somebody with some time on their hands. Oh, and all this stuff is basically a giant Roman Catholic ritual with the heptameron tacked on at the end. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. And then you better be ready for what happens. So it's really up to you as the teacher then to just, like you said, you just sit with them. And if you can't do that, then just either send them on or don't take students. Not everybody needs to teach. But most people can learn something. And that learning something would be, as we said, the most basic of meditative practices of just relaxing and breathing. Whether they'll do it or not is something else. That's another story.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bob, would you like to comment on this?
Not really much different, to be completely honest with you. I mean, it's, most of the people who show up on my doorstep, I've been practicing for a really long time. They're just stuck because the systems they had were incomplete, or their teacher didn't bother to teach them something, or didn't know, or what have you. As I'm starting to encounter a slightly larger audience, I'm having to go from my previous standpoint of, all right, we get to know each other. I see where the shortfalls in your training are, and we fix that, where things are pretty well tailored, to an approach where we've got a standard template for training now that we have to follow. And people will self-filter themselves as a result of that. Now, if you're running an in-residence program that lasts for months at a time, and you're not dealing with more than about 10 to 13 people, then you can still deal with a fairly one-on-one based way of training people. But anytime you're training more than 10 to 13 people, that one-on-one attention, to really understand where the other person's coming from and really tailor what they're doing, typically has to default to more of a curriculum-based approach, because the time's just not there to do anything more than that. Both can work. The curriculum-based approach will be slower, and a lot of people are going to drop out. That's unfortunate. It's just kind of the way it works. You see this in schools where, you got a kid who's not doing well, but he goes to a different school where he gets a little more attention because maybe the class sizes are a little smaller, and all of a sudden he's fine. But in the bigger, school, it didn't work out. See it in colleges all the time too. You go to the University of Texas where there's 2,500 kids in that introductory philosophy class, and a quarter of them fail it. Yet that kid transfers to a smaller school where the faculty to student ratio is 8-1. All of a sudden, he does fine. And that goes back to what the person needs. My internal power approach is generally self-filtering. Do you have the ability to suffer? Have you exhausted all of the possible solutions to your problem before getting here? And if you still want to solve your problem at that point, well, then you're just going to be willing to put up with whatever the hell happens. Because here's the big thing with internal power systems, by the way. Been doing this 30 years. I have, as of yet, to meet a student who came to me because they wanted to find God. Everybody's got a problem they need solved, usually health related, that conventional methods failed them, didn't work. So they had to become desperate enough to use this thing called magic that everybody will make fun of them for to solve whatever that problem is. It's kind of the way it goes, But if you want to build a big organization, now you're stuck with a curriculum-based approach because you just can't give people the individual time necessary. It's kind of the way it works.
Thank you for that. This is a valid thing. I came across this when I was a struggling private guitar teacher, and then I got introduced to a framework for supporting and building up a realistic business model to make it so I could basically afford to live and even maybe buy a house. I could only work 25 hours a week as a guitar teacher. It's full on, man. When you're dealing with people I'm acting for half an hour in a guitar lesson. I'm the loudest, most interesting, most animated theatrical person in the room to keep the attention of the students. I tell you what, at the end of the day, 8 o'clock at night, because it's mostly after hours, if you're not in a school during the daytime, I'm shattered. And so I just want to bring up this comment from Mike S. The dabblers are important, and their money allows those who are serious about it to have the resources to learn. If I didn't have just people coming in at the bottom and just hanging out and basically, I was a babysitter sometimes, there wasn't a lot of satisfaction, but I made it fun for myself. But those are the people that supported the efforts of me helping to elevate those who are really dedicated. I have no shame in that. And I've heard Mark Rasmus very openly mention this too. He's not equal opportunities. He will give everyone the best of his time, but those who are going further, they get a bit of extra something as far as the teaching input goes. And I had to be realistic about this because being equal opportunity was very taxing on my personal energy and detracted from my quality of life. So wonderful. And I've got another question here from Mark Thomas. Now, this might need a bit of interpretation, but what should those of us who are students of the Western esoteric tradition do to keep our practice pure in the face of worsening conditions? Now, I'm not sure what that means, but I'm guessing that it's like the gentlemen have mentioned here. There's a lot of information online, and a lot of it is a whole bunch of stuff that just goes nowhere. And so you could be spending valuable time exploring things that are just unhelpful or detract from your focus of what you should be doing. Personally, I found the practices I like. I just look at that and laser focus. And after years of wandering, I've just found focusing on something and getting the results, like the Barden system and the Mark Rasmus and what Bob and I work with, and that has just been top. And so, Mark, are you able to sort of dredge anything from this question?
Well, it depends on what your what your reason is for practice. So, with the Institute for Hermetic Studies, we have a curriculum. If you want it, you can come in and do the Chinese menu approach too. You just pick what you want a la carte. But we have a program of study that takes you from the beginning of the path to the end. And I'm not aware of any other easily accessible Western esoteric school that does that. There are a few, but they're not easily accessible. And they're mostly in Europe. And Europe is not in a good place if getting esoteric teachings and hasn't been for a while. So, in fact, that's why they contacted us, but that's not to get off track. So we will take you from the beginning of this path all the way to the end. And it's going to be not just the philosophical view. It's first of all building the philosophical view. Then it's building from that, what is the theoretical view in terms of technique? What is the theoretical application of that philosophy? Then what is the method? And how do you practice it? And what are the results you should expect to get from it so that you know that you're doing it properly or within a framework of proper? Because it's like anything, there may be a laundry list of 10 or 12 possible outcomes, but it's probably going to fall within 4, 5, or 6. You know, it's not going to be huge. And we know that, and that's what we do. So you practice what you're taught, and you're going to get the results that are suggested, that are mentioned. What will happen is a lot of people will get a partial teaching or a half teaching, even if the school or the individual is very enthusiastic about it. And again, it can only deliver a partial result. And that person isn't going to be fulfilled, because if you want to learn the teachings on body of light, until I wrote Between the Gates, they weren't really out there. I mean, bits and pieces were scattered here and there, but fundamentally, it was not something that you ran into in a lot of these groups. So look at what it is you want. Make sure when you talk to the person that you can get it, and stay with the teachings. Don't jump around a lot. Don't do a lot of mix and matching. Stay focused on what you've been taught, even though it hurts and you don't want to do it, and you have to do it for 2 or 3 months at a time. Because some of these practices, like if you do the Liturgy of Hermes, we've had a lot of people tell us that the Liturgy of Hermes was the first time they really had an experience. Now, they've been doing stuff for years, but this really was it. This really was an aha awakening moment for them, that it delivered as promised. And a lot of that has to do with the engagement of discipline. That when you join some of these organizations, they'll tell you to do a practice for a week or 2. Well, it takes 3 weeks to develop the habit. So we'll say 3 weeks to develop the synaptic connections to become familiar with it. Well, then you're moving on to something else. We're telling you to do this practice at particular lunar times, at particular time of the year, lining everything up so that it has the best opportunity for you. And now you're going to do it for 42 days. Well, it's going to work for you. So I think that's the best offer, or the best answer I can give you in terms of this question.
Thank you. Bob, have you got anything you'd like to add?
No, really just a nice pop culture reference to what Mark just said. Schwarzenegger says it best. You have to learn the rules before you can break the rules. If you try to play jazz without learning how to play guitar first, you're just making noise. You might be a performer, okay, but you're not a musician. And, with the internal power stuff, it takes time. It's not a quick process. It's very slow. So for a lot of people, honestly, ritual magic's a much better deal. Hey, told several people who were working doctors, yeah, my stuff's great. Fine, 60 skills, gets you a really complete toolkit. But you know what? You're a doctor. Go out, get the medicine Buddha empowerment, do all the prayers, make all the offerings, meditate upon the Buddha, medicine Buddha. Over time, you'll make contact with the medicine Buddha, and he'll begin to inform your practice, and you'll be a better physician. Because you're not a magician. You're keeping people alive, you're healing people, you're active in the community, you're doing all this other stuff. You don't have 4 hours a day to sit here, meditating on your navel, so to speak. And so that's the main thing, is just like Mark said, figure out what you want to do, find a way to do it long enough so you get out of it what it is and you develop a skill at it before bouncing on to the next shiny object. Because listen, psychic experience, easy. Everybody has these things. They're so common. The Buddhists have an excellent point where they go, hey, you know what? Don't pay too much attention to it. It's not really important. Ability, on the other hand, that's something else. That's going to take real work. It's just as Mark said earlier, 90% of this stuff is things people experience passively. We're just putting a mechanism to it. My favorite example is, I can tell somebody can be talking about some dingbat athlete or performer who talks about the energy in the crowd. And the second I go, yeah, that's true. And oh, by the way, there are ways to actively work with that. They just totally lose their minds. But getting to the point where you can actively work with it, yeah, that takes skill, it takes effort, it takes time. So learn the rules before you break the rules. That's my big advice.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. And just on that, being a stage musician, being a bass player prior to becoming a guitarist and a singer, there was a progression. I started off at the back, hiding in the back, just playing away, holding it all together. And then I grew my confidence grew a little, and then I jumped on the guitar, became pretty proficient in that. And then I thought, screw it, let's have a sing. But I found out that I've played in front of thousands of people, and I've played in front of hundreds of people. And there is a back and forth that happens between the crowd dynamic and you as the performer. They lift you up, you lift them up, and it goes back. And you can do a lot. As a bass player, it was really interesting because those low frequencies and the way you play can make the crowd move differently. And you can essentially exploit that in some ways as well and implement different ways of things moving. It was a very interesting time in my life, actually, because I was curious. You'd stay up there long enough, you're thinking about washing and doing the cooking and stuff, and you're watching how your technique changes the way that the crowd behaves. Now, I have a one last question here, and then we'll tidy things up if that's okay with you, gentlemen. Okay. Now, I'll just, once again, might need a bit of translation, but with the world IQ declining, not sure how to verify that, but, what way do you see as most effective way for preserving spiritual practices when even less people will be suitable for them moving forward? Okay, I'm just going to throw this straight over to Mr. Stavish.
Well, I think we addressed this in one of our previous discussions, and in terms of preservation, is publication, creation of media on various levels, but publication in terms of printed format books. And that's going to be one of the ways to preserve, and that is to hold the information. I think it's important to state here that if you look at this information historically, it is stated that when you have this great explosion of access like we have now, that happens only at a time of almost desperation. That while we look at it in very positive light, saying, oh, we have all this access now, get all this stuff. Well, of course, we've been telling you, and many of you already know this from experiences, yes, but separating the wheat from the chaff is very difficult. So how do we then separate that out, preserve that? You've got to put it in printed form. You've got to put it in some video form. You have to maintain the ability to access that. And that means getting that message across to the people involved that this is important. And if it is important to you, then you better make sure that you're providing the resources so that it'll exist in the future. Because again, why are you here? If you're going to get enlightenment at the end of this lifetime and never come back or go off to some other planet, then maybe it's not important to you. But If you're going to reincarnate, if you believe in that, and you're going to end up back here, then who's going to teach you then? How's that going to happen? And that question isn't asked enough in Western esoteric traditions. That's why the traditions have such a hard time holding together, because they're not really thinking about 30, 60, 80, 90, 100 years into the future. In fact, most of them really only trace back to about maybe 1880, 1870, well, we say 1888 with the Golden Dawn, but 1850s, 60s with some earlier movements. And you see into the 20th century, a lot of them really were expecting some kind of global enlightenment to take place at some point, probably roughly around 2000. Okay, give or take 10 years, 20 years. Well, that hasn't happened. At least not the way they were talking about it. So now what? What's plan B? They didn't expect to be around. These groups simply didn't expect to be around in 2025, 2050, 2075, 3000. So if you're involved in this, you have to think in those terms just a little bit. Not all the time. Unfortunately, that's people like me who have to do that. No, you have to think of it more in terms of, I'm going to do my work. I'm going to get as enlightened as possible so that I can free myself from these obscurations that plague me, this ignorance. And I'm going to provide a framework for the future for others to follow. I have come to know in order to serve.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Wonderful. Bob, have you got anything you'd like to add on this?
Sure. Look very closely at how traditional religions organize this, because these are things that survived a really long time. All right. Yeah. The little old lady with an IQ of 87, she's not going to be doing the hardcore secret teachings. But hey, that lady's going to say her mantra prayers every night. She's going to bake bread or make food for the monks. You know, again, the practices are not for everybody. Okay. So you have to build in mechanisms by which other people can participate to the limit of their ability. You know, and listen, we're going through a huge spin in this in society right now with all this AI business and advanced tech. Okay. It would be very easy to design a society that intentionally disenfranchises a large number of people. And there are people out there who want to do that, but by the way, they're pretty clear about this too. However, it's that participation that makes people part of society, even if they know from the get-go they're never going to be the guy in charge. But that's okay. The guy who goes into the U.S. Army to be a supply technician or a cook knows he's never going to be the chief of staff of the Army. He knows that on day one. There's no equation where you go from being culinary arts guy to chief of staff of the Army. But he's still doing something that's critically important to the operation of the machine. Again, there's elitism born of reality. You were blessed to be born to two parents that gave you an IQ of 170 and a healthy body, and you grew up in a developed society where everything worked. Bully for you, brother. You did nothing to earn that. Okay. But that doesn't mean the person on the other end of the spectrum doesn't have something they can offer. Because that same guy is going to be a terrible culinary arts cook. All right. He's going to be miserable. He's going to create a lot of arguments. He's going to create friction, just problems. You got to have him go do something else. You know, turning Elon Musk loose as a lineman in a box manufacturing company is a is a formula for failure. Everybody's got something they can do. You need to respect that, and you need to provide people a place for that. I mean, Mark saw this all the time, I'm sure, in his old line of work, where you had a gentleman who, back when we used the term retarded, was mentally retarded. But if we gave him a job, filling envelopes, and yeah, you probably had to subsidize that a little bit to make it worthwhile. That guy went from being angry and upset and lost to performing a function for society. So this is the thing, guys, is that 100% efficiency and focusing on the diamond end point has a tendency to leave out a lot of really important stuff. And by the way, a role for other people. You got to find that, or these things aren't going to work.
Yeah, I think to put it in a framework that, I said this years ago, I was at a major conference, and wonderful event, Neo-Pagan conference, huge, wonderful, lots of fun. But I used to tell these folks, I said, this isn't family friendly. And of course, they were laughed about it and upset because of the genital fixation that dominated a lot of the presentations. But, it was adults. It's okay. But that doesn't give you long-term survivability. If you want long-term survivability, it's like Bob said, if there's a certain religious structure, and a religious structure by its nature is an outer court. It's exoteric. That prepares you for esoteric practice. Okay, and that esoteric practice on its most basic level is the lady clutching her rosaries and saying her prayers on the most basic level. That's an esoteric practice because it's an inner relationship. And you have to create what is a family-friendly environment, which means you have to have mechanisms for children on some level. And also you have to appreciate and value the family. And that is something that is not often discussed in contemporary esotericism, and often actively denigrated. I don't want to go down that road, but that's the salvatory factor, if you want to call it that. You have to be family friendly. You have to plan and think for the future, which means you have to be life affirming. And too much of contemporary spirituality is fundamentally negative. They're not life affirming. It's not really empowering, and that has to change. And that changes by the teachers being the good example. I hope that helped.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, so many treasures in this presentation. I'm very grateful for you both. And I just want to say, if you're in the crowd and you're not sure how to support the best parts of this esoteric group or arena, there's lots of ways. If you want to help from the back, like I'm talking about, being the bass player, being a supportive person, go to do the good works out in your community. Support your local monks, your online providers of the stuff that you deem to be quality, which I'd like to think I'm surrounded by, that I choose to surround myself with, people on this channel. There are ways to support them to ensure that these things are still available. If you are in a practice and you're wanting to become a teacher, like Mark said earlier, you need to be able to explain this stuff to a little lady on the street. Write a kid's book, right? You want to get good at teaching stuff, write a kid's book, because if you can explain it to a child, then you're on the right track, in my view. And, and as far as obviously things like family go, and I mean, like if the species is going to continue, then we need to have children, and we need to teach our children well on these types of things. So it never goes amiss to find ways of improving the environment and the community through upgrading our own sort of influence expressions upon those around us. I would like to say thank you to everyone in the chat, everyone in the audience who's listened and joined us today. We're very grateful. There are many ways that you can support Mark, Bob, and myself, starting with Bob Smith at 60 Skills. Bob, would you like to give a final plug for your awesome array of hard labor that you've put forward to the world?
Yeah. Your great-great-grandparents were right. Reject libertine behavior. Embrace community. Embrace the idea of doing work. Embrace your relationships with others. Because, guys, I'm here to tell you, nobody goes to their deathbed thinking about, oh, that seating chart that I really nailed for Coca-Cola, that was it. It was that moments you spent with your friends. Me and my best, one of my closest students on a road trip in East Turkey going around the Black Sea. Just hanging out, having great conversations, holding on to someone's hand as they die. That's the important stuff. That's what you're going to remember. So these practices will deepen your appreciation and reverence for those things. And I think that's true of most real esoterica. The flashbang stuff comes and goes, guys. It's not that important. It's what we do with ourselves outside of that truly matters.
Thank you so much. Mr. Mark Stavish, any final words?
Look, there's a place for you if you want it. I mean, at the Institute, we've always got room for volunteers. People just have to want to volunteer. Their time, their talent, their treasure. We'll find a room for you, a place for you to do something with that. And if you don't want to do it for us, there's a place out there for you to do it. Just go find it. Just ask. And then you got to do it. Once you've committed, you've got to follow through. And that's where we find some people, they drop the ball. It's nice to start, but you got to learn to finish. And with that, you go to a teacher so that they can exhibit the behaviors that you're looking to develop. You're looking to see them exhibit an interaction with the invisible. That's what you're looking for. How do they engage with the invisible? And then how am I going to begin to mimic that and then internalize it? And then you become like the company you keep. So find good friends. Even if they're not involved in any of this stuff, that's fine. As long as they're improving the quality of their lives and being useful. So find good friends and hang out with them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to end. If I could ask gentlemen, please, just to stick around for a minute after I end the stream. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Please like, subscribe, and share, and all those wonderful things. These are small things that you can do that go a long way for people like ourselves. Remember that Mark and Bob both have large bodies of explorable material, both free and paid for. And this is our life's work that their life's work that they're putting forward. So please explore. Thank you so much, and we will see you all again on the next cast. See you later.
Bye-bye, guys.